whole idea of reincarnation appeared to me to be clearly a construct of the ego. You know, people ask me all the time, like, well, what do you think of Advaita Vedanta? And my answer is, the basic upshot that it's all one, totally agree with that. But I totally disagree with what they think the problem is, that there's this self that's reincarnated across multiple lifetimes, because that's introducing, in my view, an unnecessary element. The idea that, so in Hinduism, they have the belief in a soul. That's the Atman. It's the Atman that it migrates from one life to the next. And in my direct experience, that like, oh, everything is God, I am God, and I don't have a soul. There's no essential me anywhere. And so any sense of a soul is just redundant. It's unnecessary. You don't need a soul in order to drive the vehicle. All you need is God to drive the vehicle. So then on that side, I really agree with Buddhism, which says, guess what? There's no soul. That's one of the primary doctrines of early Buddhism, is anatman, or anatta, that there is no self, which is in complete disagreement with everything that was going on within Hinduism at the time. But then we have this terrible problem in Buddhism. It's like, okay, there's no soul, there's no self, but y'all still believe in reincarnation, so what's doing that? And it's like, oh, well, it's the actions of karma that's creating the stream of consciousness. And so, in other words, rather than being able to point to something concrete and definitive, it has to fall back on some kind of doctrine. The doctrine of karma, the doctrine of reincarnation. But that's a presupposition. I do not share that presupposition, and therefore that doesn't convince me of anything. Now, I do agree with Buddhists that there's no self. Guess what? It's not there. So one of the things that I do is I say, well, look, I'm a radical non-dualist. And the reason that I say that is because many of these more traditional non-dual schools, such as Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism, that they do have certain beliefs in reincarnation and beliefs in some kind of afterlife, even though in Buddhism none of that is permanent, it's all just a temporary afterlife, that these are all things that I've just rejected and say, nope, there's only God, that's it. And that's why I call it radical, that there's no spiritual metaphysics going on, there's no alternate realms, that I don't accept any of that. Now, energetically, I also reject it because I have learned how to read the energy of my being authentically. And this was part of my process of self-discovery and awakening and releasing and letting go. And so when I ask myself the question, well, is there reincarnation? Energetically, what I feel is, no, of course not. So when I was going through my awakening process and experience, these are the kinds of things that I wondered about. And then I asked myself, well, if I'm God and everything's God and I'm just this character, and then do I have a soul? And the answer that came back was just, no, of course you don't. Come on, you're introducing an unnecessary element. And then, well, is there an afterlife? No. Is there reincarnation? No. And all of that at the time was very surprising to me, because my assumption had been, well, since Buddhists and Hindus are kind of on the non-dual wagon there, that probably some of the other things that they have to say are most likely correct as well. And then what I came back with was like, no, actually, this is wrong. This is a form of doctrine, and it's actually indicative of what I would call the meta-ego of Indian civilization, which seems to be unable to let go of the concept of reincarnation. But my feeling also is that, well, if Siddhartha Gautama, if the Buddha really did reach this non-dual enlightenment, my suspicion is that he might have also rejected reincarnation and karma as well, but that would have been so radical for anyone in Indian culture at that time. You know, the moral equation always balances out because there's only one actor playing many different roles simultaneously. So at that level, we can say that, well, yeah, there's suffering, but also so what? This is the way that God plays with itself, and sometimes it's nasty. So if you don't like that, well, that's your personal take on it. Most of the suffering that we experience and encounter is actually self-created, and that even the things that we experience from outside our immediate self, we tend to compound that because since we're not aware of who and what we truly are, we don't know how to actually take responsibility for ourselves, so that then we create ourselves as the victim, and we continually put ourselves in situations to punish ourselves and to hurt ourselves because that's what we think that we deserve, okay? So everybody's walking around with their little ego character, and they're like these little puzzle pieces. And if this one says, hello, I'm wounded and need to be punished and need to suffer, it's going to find other characters that will fulfill that role for it. And this is why people end up in the same kinds of relationships again and again and again, and they've experienced the same kind of suffering again and again and again, because they're actually creating it for themselves and they're not taking responsibility for it. So a great deal of suffering, and it's not to say all of it, but a great deal of our suffering is self-inflicted. And then when we look at things that it might be hard to see, well, how is it self-inflicted? I'm just living here and some asshole from over there just dropped a bomb on my house. How did I create that? So it's a little bit hard to see from the personal perspective, but if we broaden it out and say, well, societies are just meta-egos. All collective identities are just meta-egos. We can again see that it's the ego, it's the sense of self that is creating the suffering. It's only because certain branches of Muslims think that everybody else is a heretic that they go out and kill all these other people, and that certain categories of Christians think that, well, these categories of Muslims have got to be destroyed, that we get engaged in war, right? These are all just ways that we've created this sense of self and other. And so it starts with the individual, but then egos become collective phenomena. Now, what that's not going to affect is natural disasters. Those are still going to happen, right? Because everything's got to do what it's got to do, and sometimes asteroids got to hit the Earth. You know, it doesn't matter if you're in your ego or not. That's the kind of thing that's still going to happen. Look, part of the enlightened perspective is accepting that there's always going to be some forms of suffering, and that there's going to be some things that you like and some things that you don't like. And especially from an embodied perspective, that's reasonable and it's natural. That if someone comes and step on your toe, no matter how enlightened you are, it's like, ow, that still hurt. Now, I might not get all personally uptight about it. It's like, oh, why did you do that to me? It's like, oh, well, this person is just confused. But it's still a physical pain that's there. Ow. And then there also can be times where you can perhaps transcend pain. But suffering is always going to be a part of life. So it's not the idea that we have to get rid of suffering entirely. But it is to recognize that it's up to all of us to take responsibility, that most of what you experience as suffering is actually self-created, that you've done it to yourself. And that's not to say that all of it you can have any kind of personal control over, but a lot of it you can. From the full non-dual God perspective, it just comes down to, yeah, bring it on. Essentially, it doesn't really matter what happens. I'm just attached to this life and being treated fairly and not suffering and having a good time. But I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for the fact that I'm attached to desiring pleasure and pleasantness and happiness. That I could be completely neutral about it and just, well, whatever happens, happens. It's just the thought that you're only yourself. I'm only Andrew. I'm only Martin. I'm only whoever it is that I think that I am. That's where we get trapped. But you can say, well, look, I'm both Martin and God. So I'm responsible for both ends of that. And primarily, since I'm going to experience myself as Martin in his embodied perspective for most of the time, this is where I've got to be the clearest. From the embodied perspective, there's very, very little that you actually have any control over. Really, at most, you have control over your choices and your reactions. And that's about it. And given the vast size of the universe, wow, that's a whole lot that you don't have any personal control over. You live in your life, you live in your body, and you live within your preferences, but there's no projection, there's no attachment, and there's no conflation. So a big place where we see conflation is where, from the individual perspective, people come up with moralities or the right religious belief or the right doctrine, and then project them out into reality and say, well, everybody needs to believe this, everybody needs to think the same thing. Or you could just say, well, look, this is my personal preference. I don't need to attach myself to any particular identity, but I'm also here in this body, and so I'm thirsty. So there, I'll get some water. Oh, I need to go to the bathroom. Okay, I'll go to the bathroom. And not putting any extra meaning onto it than that. So here again, we could turn to Zen Buddhism, right? When you're chopping wood, chop wood. When you're sitting, sit. When you're sleeping, when you're meditating, meditate. So you just do what you do, and you do it from a place of clarity. Whereas without the non-dual realization and the non-dual liberation, everybody's walking around from their character, which is constantly projecting. And they're never just sitting or just drinking. If we didn't have egos, we wouldn't be humans. The problem is our identification with the ego. So first you need to have an ego, and then you identify with it, but then that's also something you can transcend, and that opens you up to a level of freedom of self-expression that you wouldn't have had before. Once I became aware, I realized that this had happened every time. So I take 5-MeO-DMT, and my body would just open up, and then I would move. And these kinds of movements would take place that Martin, the character Martin, didn't know he was doing. So once I became aware, I started to get suspicious, like I think this thing is happening. Then I had the opportunity to watch other people take 5-MeO-DMT, and I saw people fighting with their egos, and they're thrashing about, and and then I saw other people where they go, oh, yes, and they'd open up, and I was like, oh, look, there it is. There's this nice bilateral symmetry. And I had also noticed that people's hands would come together, and they'd go apart, but nothing would cross this center line. And then I also observed that people would be doing this, and then all of a sudden they'd go, and they'd start doing something asymmetrical, and I could see, there's your ego. Look at that. Your ego wasn't there, and you were doing this thing that was symmetrical. And all of a sudden your ego comes back, and you start to do something asymmetrical. And so then I started watching more. Okay, when people are uncomfortable or when they're fighting with their ego, there's always an asymmetry in their body. And it might be subtle. It might just be that their eyes are looking that way. They're like, oh shit, it's over there. Oh no. Or it might be really dramatic where they're, I'm fighting and I'm trying to run away. Or it also could be if people are fighting with it that they tense up, and they might be symmetrical, but they're tense and tense. And so this is where I developed this idea that, look, the ego seems to operate most often asymmetrically in the body. And that when people go into full non-dual states of energetic expansion, they always universally show bilateral symmetry in their bodies. It's not because they mean to do it. It's just because it happens. That people, they open up like this flower. And then when people not only open up to that, but they let that energy move them with no conscious thought of their own. So there's no intention, there's no egoic intention involved. It's just a purely expressive movement of energy that their bodies always do the same thing, where their feet go up and their hands kind of roll around each other and their bodies undulate like this. And it looks the same in every single person. This is just a universal feature. It just shows up. That led me to the thought that, okay, there are certain ways that we can actually maximize this. That for one, most people aren't used to using their bodies with bilateral symmetry, where almost everything that we do engages some form of asymmetry, because that's how we interact with the objects of the world, asymmetries. So we could actually practice this, that you can practice moving your body with bilateral symmetry just to get familiar with it, for one. And that in any kind of psychedelic or entheogenic process that you're undergoing, if you're interested in non-duality, that this is the basic format that you need to follow. Now, if you want to take psychedelics and go dancing or go on a hike or engage in some kind of ritual, it doesn't matter what you do, because you're not doing that for non-duality. You're not doing that for self-liberation and realization. You're doing that for other purposes. But if you're interested in non-duality, if you actually want to liberate yourself from the structures of the ego, this is a requirement, that you need to use balanced symmetry within the body. And then this is what allows the stuck subconscious, underneath the surface energy that's been stored by the ego, that much allows it to come up most easily so that you can process these blocks out. And then it also opens up the possibility that your body can then engage with the energy fully, in these kinds of structures and practices. And it's just a good learning tool, because it's really, 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 really hard for people to do. And it seems like if this weren't so important, it would seem like, well, it should be really easy, right? That my job is I'm going to take a powerful psychedelic and then I'm just going to sit here like this and not do anything. It's almost impossible for most people, because as the ego gets challenged and aggravated, it's like, oh no, I just need to have a drink of water, then I'll come back and I'll be symmetrical in a minute. Okay, I'm going to drink some water. It's like, oh wait, no, I don't like the music right now. Let me change the music, and or let me change the lighting, or I'm just not comfortable that way, so I have to be like this, and oh yeah, there I'm more comfortable. So the ego makes up all kinds of excuses for why people can't just sit here like this. It's all about the energy. That's the only thing that's really significant that's going on here. And if the energy of the ego is present, there is holdings and there's asymmetries. And if the energy of the ego is dissolved and out of the way, then there's just this liberated sense of being. I was going to the local Santo Daime church and drinking daime. And there was this odd thing that, I'd go and I'd sit down like this, and then my left hand would start doing these things. It was the most bizarre thing, because I was just sitting there, and my ego is still present, but my arm is just doing this thing. And if someone were to come up and ask me, like, why are you doing that? I would say, well, I'm not doing it. Because from the Martin perspective, it wasn't me, somebody else was doing it. And so that was really odd that this thing was happening, but it did that every time. And then finally, there was this point where I was just sitting there, and my eyes were closed, and the ayahuasca is on, full on, so there's all kinds of stuff going on. And then this big face, this big angular face came right up to me behind my closed eyes. And it was like this angular face that kind of fractaled out into infinity. And this face came right up to me and it said, don't you want to let me be you? And internally I just said, sure. And immediately my body started doing this. And see, my thought was, as this face came up to me, it's like, oh, it's the spirit of ayahuasca. It's talking to me, and it wants to be me. Okay, I don't even know what that means. And so my body started reacting and doing this. But as that took over, what became clear was that, well, no, this isn't the spirit of ayahuasca. This is just the energy of reality itself. This is just the nature of being. And so afterwards, like some of the people at the Daime church, they asked me, like, wow, well, like, what kind of spirit were you working with there? And my answer was, well, it's just me and God, so I don't know what kind of spirits you're talking about. So some people, following a Buddhist tradition or something like that, or a Hindu tradition, they like to take psychedelics and sit here and meditate. This is wrong. You will not go all the way if you do this. You might have a nice mental breakthrough, which a lot of people have, but that's not as all the way as when it physically embodies your entire being, where there's no distinction that you are the energy of the experience. It's not an energy that you're experiencing, you are the energy, you see, and that's the true nature of being. You are energy. So, and that's another thing, when people experience suffering or pleasure, it's often, oh, I'm experiencing this thing happening to me, where then this is shifting to, no, actually, I am that. I am the energy that I experience, and some of it's positive and some of it's negative, and some of it's more static and some of it's more moving. And then also, from that point, there's this sense of that there's this immovable point right here in your heart, and that doesn't ever move, and everything else moves around it. And so there's this place of perfect stillness, and that is the true centered nature of being, and that's where it's just imperturbable. You can't upset it, you can't do anything to it.